the PhD isn't the thing that defines you. Similarly, the master's isn't the thing that defines you. It's the way that you approach problems, and it's your positivity, and it's your self-belief. And I think those are the things that are going to be most important in making a successful stab at going independent or being a freelancer.
Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast for the Geospatial community. My guest on the show today is Alastair Graham, and Alastair's been on the podcast a couple of times now talking about different aspects of the Earth observation industry. And today he's agreed to come along and share his story about how he got started out as being a self-employed consultant in the Earth observation sector. So he's going to share a whole bunch of things he did at the start, what his process looked like, what his thought process looked like, how he got himself ready, what he's learned along the way, and a few bits of advice for people that are thinking that this might be something for them. Before we get into the conversation today, I want to tell you about PlaceKey. So this is interesting. PlaceKey is not an organization as such. It's not a company. It's not a service. It's, at the moment anyway, it's just an idea. And the idea is to create a unique identifier for every geographic area in the world. So there's about 500 organizations and businesses supporting this idea, supporting the concept of creating this unique identifier. And they're hoping to create a new industry standard around it. So what is PlaceKey? There's a lot of sort of mystery at the moment about how this is going to be actually implemented. But the idea here, again, is this universal place ID that standardizes physical places. So data from different data sources can be more easily shared, matched, and located. And I guess the promise here is less time cleaning data, more time innovating, more time solving the world's problems. If this sounds like something that you would like to be involved in or want to find out more about, go to placekey.io. Hi Alastair, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're going to be talking about being self-employed in the Earth observation sector, so the Earth observation industry. And I think perhaps before we dive into the conversation around this, I think it'd be really great if you could just take a couple of minutes just to introduce yourself to the audience, and then we'll go from there.
Hi, Daniel. It's great to be back. I'm becoming a bit of a regular here, aren't I? Yeah, so I'm Alastair Graham, and I am an independent consultant around Earth observation and open data, open systems, things like that. My company's called Jogger. I'm also the current chair of the committee for the British Association of Remote Sensing Companies, and I sit on the OSGeo UK committee as well. And some of you might know me from the Seen From Above podcast. So that's me, really.
So I notice in front of your name you have a PhD. Talk us through that just a little bit. What is it and what was involved in it? And I guess towards the end, if you could explain how that has impacted your decision to become self-employed.
Okay, yeah, so that's going back a while now. So my PhD was from UCL, so University College London, and it was the geography department I was based in. The PhD itself was looking at synthetic aperture radar and how the radar waves interact with moisture both in the canopy and the soil around a potato crop. So the idea was, can you improve irrigation monitoring or irrigation? So how has it influenced my decision to become self-employed? I guess the main thing is that it gave me a confidence that if I had a problem, I could look at it in different ways and sort of break that problem down and work out how to fix it. And that's one of the things I think I would definitely say is if you're going to try and either go freelance or self-employed through a company like I have, then what you really need to be able to have in the first instance is confidence in yourself and your ability to deal with the types of things that might get thrown at you.
I think too, having a PhD is also a status symbol, right? It says to the world around you, hey, I've spent a significant amount of time, studying this, learning this, developing my skills in this area. Would you imagine that you could get the same kind of jobs that you're getting today if you have a master's?
Okay, that's an interesting one. So I don't look at it as a thing that I promote myself as having. To me, it's just it's a piece of paper. Really, I can't stress this enough. For me, the difference between maybe a master's and a PhD is that you think about things in a slightly different way once you've done the PhD. For me, that's the only difference. You might have some additional technical skills, and you'll have a piece of paper that some people might think more highly of. But really, that's not how I see myself. I guess in terms of your question about whether I would be doing the same types of work, that's an interesting one. So I've now had sort of 15 odd years of experience post PhD, and I wouldn't say that any of my work now is given to me or I win it based on my PhD. I would say it's based on my experience and the way that I can communicate what I will be doing for any individual client. So yeah, if you want to do a PhD is really useful, and like I say, it will give you this different way of thinking about a problem or approaching a problem. But I wouldn't say it's the be all and end all. And certainly these days, with so much of Earth observation being influenced by the tech sector, it swings and roundabouts, really, in terms of whether it's going to be a massive benefit to you if you want to go freelance or as an independent.
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to clarify your thoughts around that, because I think that this is something people will think about, and they'll listen to you. They'll say, well, it's easy for that guy. He's got a PhD. I only have a master's, or I only have a bachelor's, and want to know if this is still possible for them.
Yeah, so I would say it's definitely possible. It's really interesting. So I've set up Jogger in 2013, and so I've been trading for 7 years or so. And I guess really what I want to say here is that if you have an MSc, then you're going to have skills that are totally different now compared to the skills that were around in 2013. So having a PhD from some time in the past doesn't really change whether or not someone now is going to be more or less suitable for setting up on their own. Similarly, if you have a PhD now, the same things are going to stand as that I've just said. You're going to have a slightly different way of thinking about things. You're going to have slightly different experience in terms of you've done those additional years of academic study, and you will have some additional technical skills. But if you've come out from a university with an MSc, or maybe you've done 1 or 2 years post MSc working for a larger company, and you think, okay, now's the time that I really want to go freelance or independent, then the skills you have will be enough to get you started. And once you get started, it's the experience that you'll gather. And it might be that, and I find this quite often, particularly in Earth observation, it seems, and it might be in other sectors as well, that a lot of the independents and the freelancers start to clump together, and so we talk to each other. And so it might be that, if one person has an MSc and another person has a PhD, and there's an issue with a piece of work or something, you could just say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but how would you approach this?" And most people, generally in life, are really happy to help someone else if they've got a skill that they think that would benefit someone else, even if it's sort of a little bit in the same commercial domain. They'll still take some time and say, "Okay, well, have you thought about it in this way?" And I think really, having a PhD versus having a master's really comes down to personal preference as to how you want your academic studies to go. I mean, when I did my PhD, I thought I was going to be an academic for the rest of my life. And then by the time I'd finished that and a couple of postdocs, I was ready for the commercial world. So the PhD isn't the thing that defines you. Similarly, the master's isn't the thing that defines you. It's the way that you approach problems, and it's your positivity, and it's your self-belief. And I think those are the things that are going to be most important in making a successful stab at going independent or being a freelancer.
I think you covered a lot of really, really important topics here. And the first one I'd like to sort of highlight a little bit is that idea that there's a community out there of people doing freelance work, of being independent consultants that you can draw on, because when you're working in an organization, that idea of sparring, or that ability to just tap someone on the shoulder and say, "Hey, I've got a problem, can you help me?" I think that people see that as being a barrier to entry. If you go out by yourself, you might not necessarily have that community. So that's really positive to hear that the community is supportive in that way. You talked a little bit about your PhD, which was really great. And then you talked about, at the start, you were saying, I thought I was going to be an academic forever. And then you did a couple of postdocs, you moved out into the world, worked for an organization. What made you decide that, okay, working for an organization, being an employee is not right for me?
So this is quite interesting because there's a number of different things that came together in 2013 that made my going independent a thing. So really, I'd wanted to work for myself for ages, and I'd sort of thought about all sorts of different things, like running a sandwich shop and all of these other crazy things. It was just a case of I really like the autonomy. I like to be able to control when I work and how I work and what I'm working on, who I'm working for. So that was a massive driver, and that had been there ever since sort of doing my PhD, when I had total autonomy over everything. And I wasn't really finding that autonomy in any of the jobs that I had, either the postdocs or the working for the larger organizations. There were also some personal sort of family issues that came up in 2013 as well, that meant that it was time for a switch of job anyway, but I still needed to have an income, and so that this potential going independent was going to be one way of doing it. And then thirdly, there was such a huge shift that was happening in Earth observation around sort of that 2010 to 2015 type time, and it's still going on now, but it's slightly changing in its focus. But there was a massive shift in terms of all of the Copernicus data being made available, coming online. There was huge amounts of funding going into things like there's something called the Satellite Applications Catapult in the UK, which is primarily designed to try and support the Earth observation and other satellite-based industries. And that's only 15 miles or so down the road from me. There was a huge upsurge in scientific and engineering type funding and opportunities around Oxford, where I'm based. And so it seemed like the right time, both personally and in terms of the Earth observation sector. And it fulfilled that sort of nagging voice at the back of my head about how I wanted to work for myself. So that's how Jogger came about. Was all of those things happened together at the same time in 2013.
Okay, so we've got this massive confluence of things that are leading you or pushing you in this direction of being self-employed. What do you then do? Do you just go and start a website and jobs roll in? How did it work?
Well, if you're not me, that might work. Yeah. I'm very much the type of personality who likes to plan everything. And some would say that maybe I plan things too long and then miss the opportunity slightly. But so I was able to spend a few months, having resigned from my previous job. I spent a few months just trying to get my head together in terms of what I would need to make a successful business. And so I got all these books out of the library. I started going on the websites of various different sort of how to start your own business type gurus. There was something at the time called Oxford Business Link, I think, or the UK Business Link, which was again trying to give all sorts of sort of handy information to people starting up on their own. So these weren't necessarily resources that were specific to Earth observation. They were more about setting up things like being a plumber or an electrician or a cleaner or a sandwich shop or whatever. But they were all relevant in terms of just how do you work for yourself. And so I spent a couple of months, like I say, looking at all these various different things. And I actually have in front of me, I've got an A5 notebook, which is half full of notes that I made back in 2013 about all sorts of different aspects of how you set up a business. Because I wanted to make sure that if I was going to do this, that I didn't sort of mess it up within a year. So 4 or 5 lines down from the first page in capital letters is who will be my first customer. And this was something that was mentioned a lot in all of these various different resources. Was as you're planning, just think who will be your first customer. And that is the thing I think that's the bit of advice I would give to anyone who's thinking of setting up on their own right now, is you can go through all the cool ideas of what's my name, what's my logo, what sort of software am I going to use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But really, where you're going to get your first paycheck from, that is the one thing you need to be focused on, absolutely laser focused from the beginning. In fact, before you even start.
So I really like this, that you had such a strong focus on it as a business right from the start, as opposed to gathering data that you think you might need, spending money on software that you think you might need, spending money on branding or resources on branding and getting attention and marketing. You decided that the focus here needs to be as a business. And it's all that sort of boilerplate stuff that goes into making a business. It's the same, I think you mentioned, for plumbers, for builders, and for people working in earth observation. And I love that focus on who is going to be my first customer. So that was something that you put a lot of time and effort into thinking about. So who was your first customer, and how did you get them as a customer?
So my first customer was a small environmental consultancy down on the Isle of Wight, and which is an island just off the south coast of the UK. And they were looking for advice, really, about how they could drive around the island and at the same time collect information on the quality of the roadside verges. I can't remember what the reason was that they wanted to do this, but it was basically about mobile GIS and whether or not there could be any link between mobile GIS and Earth observation data and things like that. And it was a small piece of work. It was only, I think, 5 days, something like that maximum. And I got it through a personal link from one of the organizations that I'd previously worked for. And that was really interesting. So, it was nerve-wracking just being me and doing work for somebody without the backing of a whole organization and without other directors who might sort of deal with any issues that come up. Trying to work out whether I would get paid, trying to make sure that I did a good job, but also met all of the different requirements that came in for that piece of work. It was nerve-wracking, but also by the time that I had finished it and I'd invoiced, and the day that I got my payment for that invoice, it was absolutely amazing. So this was within 2 months of my setting up the company. So that was a really good start. I got some money in. I wasn't, I had something to play with, and I wasn't going to be in a negative amount of money or making a loss at the end of my first year's accounts. So that was a definite positive.
Well, what was your biggest learning coming out of that first job?
Communication, definitely. Communication. And that is the one thing that I work on every single job that I have, because everybody communicates in different ways. And if someone said to you, okay, go and monitor the roadside verges, you might think, okay, well, it needs to be monitored in one way, or using one type of technology, or recording a certain type of information from that verge, and it might not be the thing that the client actually wants. That they've got something in their head, but they've not directly specified exactly what it is that they want. So communication is absolutely key when you're working for yourself. Talk to your clients, and then once you think you've got an idea of what you want to do, talk to them again and clarify that what you think is what they think. And if there's anything, any tiny little bit that is outstanding or different between the two of you, don't make the assumption that, okay, they'll probably be okay with this. Just keep talking. And there's loads of ways of communicating. You can either fire up little examples of data, etc., or methods or whatever, and send a little video over to them, or an animated screenshot or something like that. You can pick up the phone, obviously, and talk to them. You can write really detailed, bullet-pointed emails, but really make sure that your client and you understand exactly what needs to be done, what the scope is, and what the consequences might be of any change of that scope further down the line. Because I think that's another thing that independents and freelancers do far too often, is have a slightly woolly scope, and then someone, legitimately, a client, will come along and say, oh, could you just look at X, Y, or Z? That wasn't in the original scope. So you need to change your costing based on that change of scope. But quite often, because the original scope wasn't tightly enough defined, you're not able to do that. And that really puts pressure on the individual then to deliver something, but without any additional payment for it.
I guess a lot of this comes with experience too, right? So the more you deal with people, the more you understand how you can communicate in different ways, what the expectations might be in a certain industry or for a certain type of project. And I think too, perhaps in terms of writing those estimates, right? Writing that scope of work, I think the more you do this, the better you get at it. Can you give us any hints or tips? Is there anything that you do religiously every time or have learnt to do every time in terms of writing out that scope of work?
Yeah, so like I say, it's sort of this communication thing. So years ago when I was doing my PhD, there was a professor called Clive Agnew, who I think he was professor of rivers rather than Earth observation. But I always remember he used to say, if you were doing a presentation, so this is like an academic presentation or something, he said, the way to structure your presentation would, and this is a handy hint, folks, for presentations as well as for running a business. But the way to structure a presentation is basically say what you're going to say it, and then say what you've just said, so that you really reinforce the message. And I would definitely say that that is one way of working out the scope. So you'd go and talk to, say, a company that you're going to do some work for. Listen to what they say the scope is, say the scope back to them, and then have a conversation about the scope that you've just both spoken about, and do that every time to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And it's really difficult the first time you do it, particularly if if you know that you're relatively new as a freelancer, and it might be that you haven't got a lot of time in the sector or whatever, so you haven't got loads of contacts, so the people you're working for might be unknown to you and you might be unknown to them. It is really hard to do that. But before you leave any meeting where you're either deciding what's going to go in the contract or you're potentially signing the contract, you really need to do this whole thing of define the scope, state what the scope said, redefine the scope, and make sure everyone's happy with it.
I think it's interesting that we find ourselves focusing so much on communication here, how we communicate and making sure that both parties are talking the same language. Like we're both talking about the same scope of work. We agree that these are the milestones and that when we reach this point here, then we will know that the contract is finished. Because when you think about Earth observation, immediately my mind goes to the technical side of it, right? To segmenting images, to looking at data and discovering objects in there and then doing some analysis based on that. But yeah, here the focus is so far anyway has been completely on that conversation on communication.
Yeah, and it's a total learning process. I wouldn't say I'm the best at communication, and I've been doing this for 7 years. I would say every time I do it, I learn more and I improve more, hopefully. But it is really key because it really matters if you're working for yourself. So if you're working as part of a nebulous organization where there might be, I don't know, let's say 150 people behind you, and you bid for a piece of work and you're bidding in at, I don't know, let's say £1,000 a day, and suddenly the scope changes, well, you can quite easily say, okay, well, in order to make a profit, I'm going to give this work to that person over there who's only going to be charged out at £250 a day, and I'll just give them a little bit of advice about what to do. And that's fine. But as an individual, any change of scope is basically a reduction in your fees that are coming in, and any reduction in the amount of money that you have coming in on any individual job actually makes a massive, massive difference in terms of the amount of money that you generate over the course of a year. And so you want to be ultra efficient, really, in terms of the jobs that you're doing. So technically, you want to be efficient to minimize any additional loss through things that can be really easily dealt with, like this issue of communication.
And I think a big part of communication, a big part of the scope of work is the pricing, right? How much is it going to cost? And I think when you first start out, when you're doing something for the first time, it's really difficult to know what price to set on your services. How did you go about it?
Very first time I did it, finger in the air. I didn't really know. I knew roughly what I'd been charged out at for the 2 organizations I'd worked for previously, and I had a bit of a stab at it. And then I signed up for some free business advice clinic type things that were happening in Oxford. And I got a really good piece of advice from a guy who'd spent, I think, 35 years in the IT business. And he was saying, okay, well, you you need to basically work out all the days that you're not going to be working. And that might be because you're trying to sell into a new job, or you're trying to market your business, or you're on holiday, or whatever. And then, so then you've got an idea of the number of days roughly per year that you're actually going to be working. Then you need to look at all your costs that you have. And then you need to set the target amount of money that you want in terms of a total income over the year. And once you've done set all of those different parameters, then you're in a position to work out, okay, what day rate am I going to need to charge in order to meet all of those different parameters? And I think this is one of the things that is actually really hard for people who work in organizations where every month they get a set amount of money coming into their bank account as their salary. I think it's really hard for them to see what's happening to independents and freelancers who basically get paid on a per contract, per invoice method. And it might look that any individual who's doing a piece of work has a really high day rate, but they have to remember that that day rate isn't coming in every single day for every single month in the same way that someone who gets a salary would. And so I do take issue with people who, when they say, okay, so how much is it going to cost? And then they say, oh, that's a bit high. Do you think we can maybe reduce it by X amount? And quite often it'll be 10 to 15 to 20% less than your actual day rate, which you should have at this point costed up properly. So it should be a fair reflection of what you're worth and what you need in order to keep your life going in the way that you want it to. And I really take issue with people that try and do this. I understand what they're coming from, particularly if they've got budgets and things that they need to manage. But at the same time, you're not going to go into a superstore and pick up, I don't know, a bag of rice or something and go, oh, I really want this rice. But if you could just knock off 20%, that'd be really great. Oh, and this pasta over here, 20% off that as well. Would that be great? So I find it an unfortunate situation that quite often independents and freelancers have to justify their day rate, and we shouldn't be having to do that. Our day rate should, if you're good at what you're doing in terms of setting up your business, your day rate should be an accurate reflection of your value and the amount that you require in order to meet your lifestyle.
I think there's some really good advice there about costing things out. What does it actually cost to live, and then trying to meet that target based on an estimate of number of work days throughout a month, a year, whatever. That sounds like a really good approach at the start. I could imagine that you start off in that way there, and then sort of with time, with experience, when you have more contact with other people in the community doing similar work, that you can kind of adjust those levels as well.
Yeah, definitely. And the type of work that you're doing. So certainly as you start to talk to others who are doing similar types of business, what you really want to be able to do is get everybody on a rough parity. I mean, everyone will be slightly different day rates, but if, say, I don't know, 5 independents were going for a piece of work and 4 of them were all coming in at, I don't know, let's say £500 a day, and then someone, the 5th one came in at £100 a day, you know that whoever's going to be awarding that is going to look at the £100 and go, ooh, value for money down there. And that really doesn't help the other 4. Whereas if everybody was in a rough zone somewhere around 400 to 600, then that really, it helps make that message that you're worth a certain amount, and that those people who are working in the sector are worth a certain amount and are providing a certain amount of value. It really reinforces that message.
Yeah, for sure. I think the more people that are doing it, the more you sort of strengthen that message and say, well, this is this, and then it becomes almost like an industry standard. We expect to be charged X amount of dollars, for this kind of task. We touched on it a little bit before. You talked about perhaps having a different pricing for different kinds of tasks. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear, are there any kind of tasks or jobs or projects or employers, for that matter, that you won't go near, that you won't touch because you can just see it's going to be problematic for whatever reason?
Mm-hmm. So I would say, personally, I've made a decision based on my environmental background that I I will not take on work in the defense sector or from the oil and gas sector. And I totally recognize that's where the money is at the moment, but which is sort of putting myself at a disadvantage. But if someone was to approach me from those sectors wanting advice or something like that, I am quite happy to point them towards other independents that I know of within my network. And so again, this is one of those things where I don't think as independents we have the luxury of being selfish. We should be sharing out. If there are people who want to work in those sectors, and there are plenty of people who will, then that's fine. I am quite happy to pass that on. It's just a personal thing of mine that I don't really want to be working in those for sort of like personal environmental ethics, I guess. In terms of financing, yeah, I'm always willing to have conversations with anyone who's interested in taking up my services. I came across a startup. This must be about 5 years ago now, and they were absolutely brilliant. So they were a startup and had been trading for, I don't know, something like 6 months. I was relatively new in the sphere. They didn't know me. I didn't know them. And there was a piece of work that would have been worth, a few grand. So it wasn't huge, but at the same time, it wasn't to be sniffed at. And they came up with a really good idea of, okay, let's do a piece of work that will be like 500 quid, 600 quid, something like that. That will then see how we work together in terms of this communication that I've already talked about. It will see how I invoice, and I will be able to see how quickly they pay. And it was a really good exercise for both parties, I think, but certainly for me, in just building up a level of trust between two different organizations, so Jogger and this other startup, in terms of how we might do business in the future. And from that, other contracts did come. So it was, and I've tried to apply that model to a couple of other new clients that I've had since then. And actually it does work really well, that you have a really small piece of work that's relatively low risk to the independent or the freelancer, and relatively small budget to the client. And you just work together to see how it might go in future. And then from there, you can start to build up into larger and larger contracts.
I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's the idea here is that we can feel each other out, right? So we can try this thing. If it works, great. We can continue. We can move on. How much of your work, or have you seen more work coming from existing clients? So oftentimes, if you think about selling a product, people will say it's easier to sell a product to someone who's already bought from you. If you go to McDonald's, for example, they call this upselling. Do you actively do that? So you do some work for a client, okay, that worked out really well, that was a successful project, but I can see that you need help over here, or I could do this, or I could do that. How much of a part of your business is that side of things?
Personally, I would say it's massive. So this whole concept of getting rework back in from an existing client is really big certainly in this sector. I think if you can help on an individual project or an individual problem that a client has, then in all likelihood, similar types of projects or problems will arise in the future, and you'll be able to help out again. Plus, like I say, it comes back to building these relationships with clients and having good communication, et cetera, et cetera. I have been asked, since we've come into lockdown with the global pandemic, I have been asked, how do I get new clients? And I must admit, this is a tricky one now, because a lot of the ways that I was getting new clients was going to in-person events and being able to either stand at the front and give a presentation about something, and then follow up with people individually about various different questions. And then from there, just sort of go, oh, okay, that's interesting. Maybe we could work together, et cetera, and then follow through on that. Or is that whole thing that I think loads of people around the world are missing, which is let's grab a coffee and have a quick chat about this issue that you've got, or this thing that I've mentioned that you're interested in, et cetera. And that's been another great way for me to get sort of new clients and additional work. Now, obviously, all of that has disappeared. I think it's going to be much tougher on individuals because we're not really in a position to start spamming emails all over the place with marketing spiel, etc. Or if we did, I don't think it would be seen that favorably. And so really the concept of strengthening relationships with existing clients is really the way forward, I think, at least for the next 12 months, where you're going to want to make sure that you're doing really good work for good clients, and just making sure that things are paved tentatively through the next 12 months.
I'd really like to stay with the idea of getting new clients, because you're right. I mean, this is a big issue now with the lack of these in-person events due to the global pandemic. But you have a website, you have a social media presence, you're active on Twitter, you blog, and I've seen you on LinkedIn, for example. You also have this amazing podcast. Any of these, can you see any opportunities around any of these activities in terms of generating new business, of getting contacts to new clients?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I do have all of these online presence, and I have, well, I think a reasonable amount of interaction through different channels. However, I personally currently use them as a way of raising my profile as to who I am and sort of what I do and the types of opinions that I have on various different things around the Earth observation sector. I've not actively tried to translate any of those different online presence into work coming in. And I will be honest, I don't think in the 7 years that I've been running Jogger, I don't think that I've actually managed to get any new clients coming directly through those, although there might be one or two that have come through my website, and then I've built up a relationship with those clients. So I might be just mistaking where the first contact came from in terms of that. But generally, I don't see that as a way of getting clients. And I might be missing a trick here, and I might be mistaken in how useful all of those different online contacts would be.
I think it's very hard to trace people, back to the first point of contact. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost impossible. We put these things out into the world, and I think for the most part, it's really difficult to say exactly which one, tipped the scales in your favor, that, encouraged them to visit your website, that then led on to a relationship. And this is assuming that the person can actually remember it, right? Like, oh, I saw that tweet,
Yes.
and that led me through this rabbit hole, and then all of a sudden you're working at our office. So I get it that's really difficult. So we've talked a lot about communication. We've talked a lot about the business side of it. In Earth observation and geospatial, this is a technology industry. I'd be curious to know what tools you use, and if you ever run into the problem where you simply don't have access to a tool. Because you don't have access to a particular tool, you just don't take on certain projects.
Oh yeah. Oh, definitely. Okay, so as I think I mentioned at the beginning, I'm on OSGeo UK's committee, which sort of demonstrates that I'm a big proponent of open source and open data. And I made the decision right at the beginning that Jogger was going to be an open source led business, and therefore I've only been using Ubuntu Linux on all of my work machines, actually, for the entire 7 years. And so I generally use things like QGIS and Saga GIS in terms of my processing, GDAL at the command line. And then in terms of doing sort of documents and things like that, I have I know it's not open source, but it's easy to use. I have a Google business account, and so do everything through that, mainly because it means that I can access any of the documents I need from wherever I am, whether I'm in someone's office or if I'm on leave and away and something needs to be done, then I can access those documents. So in terms of the very basics, it's as much online as possible. So Google Business Apps being the main one. And then in terms of the geospatial side of things, it's GDAL command line stuff, and then QGIS and Saga are the main ones, and then a little bit of Orfeo Toolbox as well now and again, depending on the project. Now, in terms of things that I miss, I don't know whether or not Erdas Imagine actually runs on Linux or not. But anyway, I wouldn't be able to afford a license. So I do miss that. I used to use that a lot in previous work, and it was really easy to use and very, very powerful and very extensible. So that's definitely one thing I miss. The other thing that definitely stops me getting work is the amount of job opportunities that state must be able to use ArcMap or ArcGIS as was. And again, so I don't use that. I haven't used it for, well over 10 years now. And it's not, again, I don't think, I'm fairly sure it doesn't run on Linux. And it's not a piece of software that I would necessarily want to offer anyway. I prefer using all the open source stuff. But yeah, that often comes as a stipulation. And it's so ingrained. It's a bit like having Microsoft Office, I guess, being the de facto Office software that everybody just talks about. I mean, ArcGIS is the de facto GIS software. But yeah, that does stop me getting pieces of work, I think. Or at least it stops me going for pieces of work.
But I think the interesting thing here too is that despite the lack of access for whatever reason to these different tools, that you're still running a successful business, you're still getting jobs, and you're still being able to trade as a self-employed person in the Earth observation space.
Yeah, well, it shows the power of the open source community, really. Some of the tools that are out there now they're certainly, all the ones I mentioned are as good as some of the proprietary tools. And a lot of the proprietary tools actually use the open source in the background anyway. But yeah, there's no reason why you can't use open source to run a business. That's, lots of people do that, and that's perfectly fine. I guess one or two other things that, like little asides, that may now and again cause issues is if there's little bits of software that only run on Windows. I don't have any Windows machines in the business, and I haven't used Windows, again, probably for 10 years or more. And so now and again I get asked questions, sort of technical questions like, oh, we've got this issue with a piece of data on this piece of software. How would you sort it out in Windows? And I have to honestly go, I have no idea, because I don't know what Windows 10 looks like, let alone what it does. So there are all sorts of little things that come up every day. But like I say, you can create a successful business using whatever software you want to, really, as long as it interacts well with the data.
I think we've come a long way in the conversation now, and I want to sort of move towards the advice bit of this episode. And I'm wondering, what advice would you give to someone today if they were wanting to be self-employed in the Earth observation space?
I would say do it, but think about it for a little bit beforehand. So quite often the way that people look at this type of thing is that they will sort of get really excited and go, oh yeah, I'm going to offer these services and I'm going to make loads of money every year. And the reality is that you're going to spend most of your time being a salesperson trying to convince people to give you that money. But at the same time, there are the barrier to entry into Earth observation at the moment is the lowest it's been since I've been in the sector. And being able to know how to use some of the open source tools in particular, but also the proprietary tools, being able to know how to code in Python or R, being able to know how to get access to the open data, that just gives you such a good platform to start from, that then it's going to all be about building your network. That is going to be the main thing, is building up contacts, making sure those contacts are happy with the type of work that you do, or at least know that you exist and can point you at other potential clients. So those are, I guess those are the main things. Go for it. Make sure your network of contacts is really good. Make sure that your software and everything else is well planned, thought through and planned out, and make sure that you're confident, because there's so many opportunities in Earth observation at the moment.
Thank you, Alastair. I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate you being so open and honest about your business. So when you start a business, it's a very personal thing. In fact, I think sometimes it's almost impossible to separate the business from the person. So I appreciate you sort of drawing back the curtain and letting us look inside and walking us through what it was like to start and where you are at today. Thank you so much for that. before I let you go, is there anywhere where the listeners can go if they want to reach out to you, if they want to hear more about your business, or if they just want to continue this conversation?
Yeah, so there's probably three main ways. On Twitter, I'm at AJGJogger, and Jogger is GEOGER. So you can send me a message there, or go to jogger.co.uk, which is my website. You can find out a bit more about my business there. And then if you just want to hear my opinions, basically, and that of my co-host Andrew on the Scene From Above podcast, then check out scenefromabove.org.
Thanks again, Alastair. I really appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you very much.
At the start of this episode, I mentioned PlaceKey, and I said that it wasn't an organization and it's not a business. It's more of an idea at this stage, but the idea is really cool. The idea is to create a new industry standard around the way we join different data sets spatially. So there's a lot of questions at the moment still around the implementation of this, but the concept is being backed by a huge amount of companies and organizations. If this sounds interesting to you, if you'd like to be involved, if you'd like to find out more, I would encourage you to go along to placekey.io and check it out for yourself. Just before I say goodbye, I want to mention a few of the really big things that I got out of this conversation with Alastair. The first one for me was that it had to be a business, right? So he was making a business, and he had that strong focus on building a business first. In fact, one of the first things he did was to figure out who his first client was going to be. And then another thing that really shone through in this conversation, at least for me, was the focus on communication. We spent most of the conversation talking about how communication between Alastair and his clients was key to successful business relationships, to maintaining those relationships. And those relationships are actually what his business is based on, and they continue to generate revenue for him because he continues to get projects based on the clients that he's got already because he has a good relationship with them. Another thing I found really interesting was that he could build an entire business based on open source tools. So it wasn't necessarily the tools that were holding him back. He did mention that because he had decided to only use open source software in his business, that there were projects that he couldn't apply for, which is fair enough. But I think the fact that he can do it, that he can have a successful business based on open source products, free software that we all have access to, is absolutely incredible. Okay, those are just a couple of key points there that I wanted to highlight that I found particularly interesting. I hope this conversation has helped you. If you're sitting out there wondering if you can make a go of it, if you can be self-employed in the Earth observation industry, I really hope this has given you something to think about and perhaps a bit of direction as well for how you might get started. And that's it for another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel. It's been a pleasure being your host again this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's much appreciated. If you want to reach out to me, I'm most active on Twitter. Just look for Mapscaping, and you can also find me on LinkedIn. Those two platforms seem to be where I find myself spending most of my time. Yeah, if you want to get a hold of me, there's lots of places to do it, and I would love to hear from you. Okay, that's it from me. We'll talk again next week. Bye.